Good evening. Welcome to the 2023 award ceremony for the Peter Bryce Prize. I'm Jim Turk, Director of the Center for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University, and I'm delighted you're able to join us tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking to you tonight is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed by multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. The Center for Free Expression awards the Peter Bryce Prize annually to recognize and honor individuals who serve the greater good in society by courageously speaking up about wrongdoing and abuses of public trust. The prize is named after Dr. Peter H. Bryce, an early Canadian physician and whistleblower whose humanity, courage, dedication, and integrity led him, starting in 1907, to speak up about the appalling public health conditions in residential schools in Canada. His research exposed that the death rate of children in residential schools averaged 14 to 24%. His superiors in the Canadian federal government refused to publish his report. He persisted in writing and speaking about what was happening in residential schools, ultimately having to leave his job in the federal government and subsequently publishing a pamphlet entitled The Story of a National Crime. The Peter Bryce Prize comes with an award of $10,000 through the generosity of the Zita and Mark Bernstein Family Foundation. I'd like now to call upon my colleague Sandy Boucher, a senior fellow at the Center for Free Expression, to announce the winner of the 2023 Peter Bryce Prize and to tell you about this remarkable whistleblower. Sandy?
Thanks, Jim. I'm really pleased, I'm thrilled in fact, to announce that the 2023 winner of the Peter Bryce Prize is Ross Alderson. Many of you may already know who Ross is. I'm going to tell you a little about who he is and what he did and why he's being recognized with this award. Ross started his career as a police officer in Melbourne, Australia, working in both uniform and CID duties. In 2008, Ross moved to Canada and he joined the BC Lottery Corporation as a lottery investigator. He worked his way up through the system as a casino investigator and later came to manage investigations before he was transferred to the anti-money laundering area, and ultimately he became the Director of Anti-Money Laundering Investigations and Intelligence in 2015. During this period, Ross worked at the River Rock Casino and regularly reported suspicious activity that he encountered to the police, FinTrack, and the BC Gaming Policy and Enforcement Branch. An investigator by training, Ross saw significant evidence of suspected money laundering of criminal proceeds through the casino and felt that it was incumbent upon him to do something about it. He was at this point admonished for refusing a suspicious transaction and for questioning casino patrons regarding suspicious funds and refining, which is changing small denomination notes into larger denomination notes at the casino. Ross continued to be concerned about the scope and the scale of what he was seeing and was perturbed at the lack of response or enforcement in relation to what seemed to him to be clear evidence of blatant criminal activity. In 2015, he recommended establishing a $20,000 limit to trigger a source of funds interview for patrons, asking them where did the money come from, who were making cash buy-ins at the casino. If this had happened, it would have been a first in North America, but sadly, it was never implemented. Ross continued his work and developed practices and intelligence regarding the money laundering that was being observed in the casino by him and his colleagues. The work of him and his team at the BCLC led to critical information being provided to the RCMP, and this in turn led to an enormous RCMP investigation of alleged underground bankers in Richmond, BC. This group was estimated to be laundering over $1 billion Canadian a year. The so-called e-pirate investigation started in 2015 and targeted Richmond-based Silver International, an alleged illegal money services business. The investigation culminated in a series of undercover raids in October of 2015. At the time, the RCMP said they seized millions in cash, as well as BC Lottery Corp casino chips from Silver's office in a Richmond business complex, as well as computers, cell phones, and digital evidence containing tens of thousands of documents from Silver's office and other locations. It was believed to be the largest ever money laundering probe in Canadian history, and it was a critical prosecution for BC. Silver took in about $1.5 million in criminal cash deposits every day and distributed funds to about 600 bank accounts in China, as well as using cash from Vancouver drug dealers and casino loan sharks to fund Chinese high rollers in the casino. The Financial Action Task Force is the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog, which sets international standards that aim to prevent these illegal activities and the harm they cause to society. In 2018, FATF conducted a case study of the e-pirate investigation and estimated that the alleged professional laundering network washed over $1 billion a year. One component of the network's alleged money laundering was to use legal and illegal casinos to help gamblers from China move money to and from Canada, and in some cases, to cash out chips for a BC casino check, which they could then deposit into Canadian banks and use it to buy Vancouver real estate. The FATF report also alleges that the underground bank used BC as a hub to perform crucial drug trafficking and global money transfer services for multiple groups, including Chinese triads, Mexican cartels, and Middle East organized crime groups. This investigation validated the concerns raised repeatedly by Ross, but he continued to be frustrated by the lack of response by the authorities, which appeared to be more concerned about jeopardizing provincial tax revenues from the casinos. One of the key figures behind Silver International, Paul King Jin, was later found to have been behind multiple illegal casinos and became involved in property deals in BC in the hundreds of millions of dollars. His methodology later became known as snow washing and the Vancouver model, a finding that reverberated around the world and reflected very poorly on Canada and on Vancouver in particular. Jin was never charged in the case. A second police operation a few years later also failed to result in charges against him. In September 2020, Jin and one of his associates were the victim of a shooting in a Vancouver restaurant, and his associate died. He survived. In the face of continued inaction by the relevant authorities, Rost raised his concerns to the Assistant Deputy Minister level and ultimately went to the media with evidence of both the criminal money laundering and government inaction. This led Ross to meet with Sam Cooper, a global news reporter who ultimately documented the story in his book, Willful Blindness. If you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend it. Ross also gave an interview to CTV's W5 investigative television show in February 2019, and the full truth about what was going on came to the attention of the then Attorney General of BC, David Eby, who decided to act. Eby retained a former RCMP investigator, Peter German, to look into the issues, and the German report, which came out in May of 2019. The report outlined very serious problems, and the Vancouver model of laundering money and the term snow washing entered the Canadian lexicon. The German report led to the Cullen Commission, which is now the driving force behind significant changes in casino AML programs and the real estate market. Ross testified before the commission in 2021 and is mentioned 282 times in the Cullen Commission's report. The Cullen report has garnered global attention, and behind all of this is one whistleblower, Ross Alderson. As usual, his journey has been marked by hostility, safety threats, ostracization, and open attacks by all sides at the Commission. He stayed true to his moral compass, even when he had to leave the country for his own and his family's safety and sanity. The consequences of Ross's actions reach far beyond the activities of one BC casino. The identification of this new typology for money laundering has had global implications, and the FATF report was an early indicator of this. Changes to British Columbia laws and law enforcement's AML thinking and activities are the start of wider ramifications. Control and prevention activities in casinos have become more focused and effective, and further changes are still underway. Money laundering impacts on real estate in Canada has now also come into focus, and significant regulatory changes are starting to be felt there too. Canada and provincial jurisdictions have finally made progress on developing effective corporate beneficial owner registries. Unexplained wealth orders are being considered, and the federal government recently announced changes to the operations of FinTrack, as well as a plan to develop better mechanisms for whistleblowers to report money laundering and better protections for those that do. Ross, what you've done was just outstanding. You have really made a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Ross, it gives me great pleasure to present you the 2023 Peter Bryce Prize and the $10,000 cash award that goes with it. Now, since I'm in Canada and you're in Australia, we're happy to do this presentation virtually. Ship the prize to you. If you could hold it up for the audience, just back.
You can see it.
Yeah, so they can see it. Good. So thank you. And Ross, I'd like to invite you to say a few words just about the journey you were on and whatever you'd like to share with the audience.
Sure. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Sandy, for that very kind introduction and I think a very comprehensive overview of what happened. So first, I'm very honoured to accept this award named after Dr. Peter Bryce, an individual I believe had incredible integrity and a trait that I think every whistleblower needs is a lot of resilience. I'm going to talk a little bit about the personal journey that I went through and some of the things that I've faced. And as Sandy mentioned, I came to Canada in 2008, and I first became exposed to the casino industry in 2011 when I was at the River Rock. You know, as a former police officer, I was immediately struck by the volume of suspicious cash being accepted into the casinos, and for the most part with no questions asked. You know, when a foreign national turns up with a wad of Canadian cash secured by rubber bands and carried in a plastic shopping bag, claiming to be a foreign business owner, well, to not at least ask the patron some questions around the source of cash to me was, let's just say, very surprising. Particularly as these were government regulated and managed casinos. However, the industry position at that time was essentially, look, it's up to law enforcement to prove any funds or individuals were criminal. Otherwise, pretty much all transactions were accepted, regardless of how suspicious they may appear. Now, in BC, unlike Ontario, where police were stationed inside some of the casinos, there really was no visible law enforcement presence. And again, I found it surprising because police were receiving a copy of all the FinTrack suspicious transaction reports and had since around 2008. There was a provincial regulator, GPEB, but they were essentially a Monday to Friday operation, as was BCLC investigations at that time. You know, and Sandy's given a good overview of all that, but, you know, it was interesting during testimony at the Cullen Commission that GPEB senior managers stated they didn't intervene in cash buy-ins or get involved with patrons because they were fearful, as they knew some of these gamblers were linked to organised crime. So I wonder how that is providing a safe working environment for gaming employees. So, you've got a situation where enforcement agencies knew or suspected there was criminal activity, yet they were virtually a non-existent presence. And I think it's a fair question to ask if that was by design. I didn't subscribe to the detect and report mentality, which was my job. And I did get to meet a few very interesting individuals during my time at River Rock. This included a globally known high-level organised crime figure who I personally escorted off the property, a Burnaby politician who by day who moonlighted in the high limit rooms, handing out gambling chips from his man purse most evenings. Sandy touched on a refining incident, and it was a so-called VIP who I witnessed refining small bills into large bills on 2 separate occasions, totaling $200,000. And my intervention in into that incident certainly stirred things up a bit. All of these individuals at one time or another regularly frequented the high limit rooms, and one of them even socialised and travelled abroad with industry management. I left the casino sector in 2012 to take up another role at BCLC, but in 2015 I was offered the role of Director for Anti-Money Laundering. And based on my previous casino experience, I was quite reluctant to take up this role, but BCLC had new leadership and I saw this as a chance to make a real difference. Saying that, a few months before I was hired, the then CEO of BCLC was on record with a Vancouver Island newspaper, and I'll quote the following: "Many of the players from Asia prefer dealing in cash, so they do come in with bags of cash or bags of money for their buy-ins. We know their source of wealth. We know all their personal information." Now, that statement did not age well, particularly through the Cullen Commission. Now, regardless, there had been some mandated changes in the federal AML landscape with FinTrack, so I decided I would take the role. I told my wife at the time that I'm either going to fix it or I'm going to expose it. And I knew I was going to have to be very, very careful. So that summer, I met with an RCMP inspector who confirmed they had uncovered direct links between casinos and criminal activity amounting to millions of dollars. And that investigation, as Sandy pointed out, was ePirate, which infamously folded years later. At the time, though, the ePirate investigation was a significant event and really was the catalyst for massive change in the industry. I was able to share that information, so now to do nothing would make the industry complicit in accepting proceeds of crime. So protocols were put in place in 2015 to ban players based on cash buy-ins, although it was always generally after the fact and was a slower process than I had anticipated. Later in 2015, I met with an RCMP intelligence officer who warned me to watch my back. He told me that my name was being openly discussed by people inside and outside the industry as the individual pushing the change in the industry. While no specific threat was conveyed, I took the warning seriously and took several precautions. I was also asked by the RCMP to help identify phone calls from a casino to the cell phone of the target of the ePirate investigation. While I was unable to establish who made the call, other than it originated from the casino, it reinforced to me concerns of potential industry involvement. Later that year, RCMP conducted a number of search warrants on properties in Richmond, including suspected illegal casinos. And Sandy's already mentioned that, but I was also made aware through law enforcement sources that investigators were of the strong belief that one or more of these locations and the date of the warrant itself had been compromised. In the fall of 2015, I authored a report for my supervisor. I stated that we, BCLC, could and should do more, and it was also the right thing to do. That report, as Sandy alluded to, included 7 recommendations, including a source of funds request. During the Cullen Commission, it was claimed by an industry executive that all suspicious transactions be refused after my report was submitted, and that went further than my request. However, will be almost 3 years later after the media scrutiny and the release of the Dirty Money report, and there was an implementation of $10,000 threshold, and reported suspicious cash transactions almost completely stopped. And the industry's own data shows this clearly. And it's hard not to think how much dirty money entered casinos in those intervening years. Around 2017, I took a trip back to New Zealand. My friends and family in New Zealand all thought I had this great job and I was a real success story. But I remember coming back to Canada feeling very unsettled. I felt I was living a lie and I could no longer in good faith represent an industry which I'd come to resent. And while the Cullen Commission probably really focused on casinos, to me it was always much bigger than that. I had visibility into the relationships between alleged organised crime figures, local members of government, and Chinese consulate officials. Much of this information is now in the public domain and is well documented in the book Willful Blindness by a guy I know pretty well called Sam Cooper. So yes, in 2017, after I'd had enough, I sought out Sam, and the rest, as they say, is history. As a result, my whole world got turned upside down. I anticipated I had opened up a huge can of worms, but I never realised how much animosity I'd be faced with, including, surprisingly, from the Cullen Commission itself. During a visit to Australia in 2019, I made the decision I was going to move back there. I had a very warm response in Australia on that trip, including from Australian law enforcement and Australian intelligence services, who I met with and who were very interested in my experiences. It was fair to say at that time I did not feel either valued or safe in Canada. So in 2020, at almost 50 years old, I left Canada to start all over again. I had a young child of 6 in tow, and neither my wife nor I had confirmed jobs to go to. We moved during an international pandemic among lockdowns and experienced all the craziness of that period. In 2021, during the space of 4 months, my father-in-law and my father both passed away. The Cullen Commission was underway and the media in Canada was speculating on my mysterious disappearance. Not so mysterious, really, considering I had told the Cullen Commission I was moving to Australia about a month before I left. So after my competency, my integrity, and my mental health were all questioned very publicly, I was drawn back in and I agreed to get involved with the Cullen Commission. Let's just say the experience wasn't awesome, and I felt like I was the piñata at their little party and they all wanted to go with the stick. But I'd like to finish with this. Look, I had a really tough 5-year period, easily the toughest time of my life. In 2015, I believed I was followed home from a casino as a result of my conversation with RCMP Intelligence. That same year, I set up a home security system. I started looking under my car for explosive devices and used to start my car away from the house and away from my family, just in case. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed. I had the brake lines on my car one day mysteriously damaged. And I also lived in Richmond, which was ground zero. So I was always on guard. I didn't live in fear, but somewhere between paranoia and heightened situational awareness. There were safety concerns. My family was placed on a police emergency response list, but there was also the cryptic emails and there was legal intimidation. But as a whistleblower, there's also sadness of leaving colleagues behind, many who I liked and considered friends. And of course, there was the greatest sadness of losing family as well. This whole experience almost broke me, but it didn't. I believe what I did was in the best interest of British Columbia, and I did it for British Columbians. And so I'm honored to accept this award. But it's as much an award for my incredible, resilient wife who believed in me and stuck by me when others would have run for the hills. I also want to share this moment with my amazing family and friends who kept me sane. I have a lot to be grateful for. So thanks again to Jim, to Sandy, and to the folks at Ryerson for this award, and also to the Zita and Mark Bernstein Family Foundation for their wonderful generosity. I would like to leave you with a well-known Maori saying, which I was reminded of a few years ago by a friend in New Zealand when things got particularly tough. the phrase is kia kaha. It means stay strong. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ross. And it's an honor for us to be able to recognize the significant contribution you made by giving you this prize. I'd like to also thank the audience for joining us this evening and to share with you that the nominations for the 2024 Peter Bryce Prize can be made by any member of the public. The nomination form is on the Center for Free Expression website, which is cfe.torontomu.ca. And nominations are accepted until December 31st of 2023. So we'd encourage, if you're aware of a whistleblower you feel should be considered for this prize, please nominate them. The biography of Peter Bryce and information about previous winners of the prize are also available on our website. So again, Ross, it is a pleasure and an honor to have recognized your contributions. And wish everyone a good night. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, good night.